Welcome to our first webinar of the 2017 Alternate Eligible Content Winter-Spring Series. Today's presentation is entitled Using Alternate Eligible Content to Develop IEPs. This presentation is meant to be an update from our 2014 previously recorded webinar of using alternate eligible content to develop IEPs. Please note that the previously recorded webinar will no longer be available on the patent website, and it will be replaced by today's information. If you are new to alternate eligible content and essentialization, please visit our website, www.patent.net, and visit the Educational Initiatives tab of Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities. Once you get on this page, you will see a box to your right and a place where you can click on Previously Recorded Webinars. There you should find all the information in regard to alternate eligible content and essentialization. Let's get going. While you're viewing this webinar, if you have questions or comments, please send them to alternateassessment@patent.net. Please reference today's date, 1/25/2017. Any questions and answers received will be posted as an FAQ with the recorded webinar following this presentation. Our focus today will be on, first of all, how to select alternate eligible content for meaningful grade appropriate goals and objectives. There is a lot of content in each grade, and where do you start and how do you prioritize? We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about considering how meaningful and measurable the goals can be for your student aligned to alternate eligible content. And part of that process is around essentialization, and I know we've talked about this for many webinars, but to determine when and how to essentialize when developing IEP goals and objectives. And we hope we give you some good examples today. One more thing is that we will take just a brief amount of time to help us stretch into thinking about the rest of our webinars in this series. What are the next steps when a student has demonstrated mastery or achievement of the identified goals that you have aligned to alternate eligible content? We're also going to visit what are the next steps that you take when a student has not demonstrated mastery or achievement of identified goals aligned to the alternate eligible content, which is equally important to know when you're teaching. So basically, when we think about alternate eligible content and bringing that together in the IEP, our focus is always around learning and growth for each individual student. So how can we take the information that is in the alternate eligible content and present it with goals and objectives that can represent challenging learning and lifelong learning and growth for students? Some important information about the alternate eligible content. What students should be accessing the alternate eligible content, particularly if you're new to the content? It is a reduced depth and breadth of the PA core standards, so it is appropriate for students who are eligible for the alternate assessment in Pennsylvania, also known as the PASA. And it is the content that we access for the PASA is the alternate eligible content. There are no longer alternate content standards. There are no longer alternate anchors. The anchors and PA core standards, descriptors, eligible content all line up for the alternate eligible content. There is a very clean alignment back into our PA core standards. What if the alternate eligible content seems too complex? We get that question a lot. So the alternate eligible content, we just want to remind you, identifies the upper boundary of performance for students eligible for the alternate assessment. If you remember, in the alternate assessment, students have the capacity to demonstrate achievement at 3 distinct levels. So when we think about the alternate eligible content, you want to think about looking at it the way it is written as that upper boundary of performance, so that upper level of performance. But we also know that the alternate eligible content can be essentialized through a process that we have shared quite a few times through our webinars that allows the content to remain aligned, but at even further reduced levels of complexity. So we talked about some important information about alternate eligible content. Now we're really going to discuss some important information about our IEPs. And this is a big question that we get a lot. Must IEP goals reflect the alternate eligible content? IEP teams determine the goals and objectives based on individual student needs. It's the fact, it's the way it has always gone, and that is the way it will always go. The IEP teams have quite a challenge and a job when they meet and discuss what is important and what should be prioritized for students to learn. We also know these goals should include academic content, as it is defined in the alternate eligible content. So it is a reduced depth and breadth of the PA course standards. It provides access to the general education curriculum as stated in IDEA. We also know IEP teams may also consider goals and objectives that lead towards independent living skills. And again, that is an IEP team decision. Another fact is that the alternate assessment will be assessing the alternate eligible content that is aligned to the PA course standards. So let's get started thinking about using the alternate eligible content to develop IEPs. We talked about considerations for thinking about what content is important to use. So here are some very important steps that we're going to look at in more depth in this section. Number 1, as a teacher, review and become familiar with the alternate eligible content. In order to be able to speak with knowledge at an IEP team meeting and to consider what is most appropriate and should be prioritized, all starts with getting to know it. Secondly, it's really important to have the information and the performance data about each of your students. So let's look at this a little bit further. Thinking about reviewing the alternate eligible content. First, use the assigned grade for the identified student. So what has been assigned as that student's grade? It's typically could be the grade level that your student takes with the PASA this year. So then once you know the grade level, examine the content for English language arts, including that writing, and we talked about that last month, math and science. You can find the alternate eligible content for English language arts and math and writing on the Patent website under the tab for students with significant cognitive disabilities. That is the Educational Initiative tab, and then students with significant cognitive disabilities. To find the science draft alternate eligible content, you would go to the Educational Initiatives, Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities, and click on PA Alternate Assessment. Under that tab, you will find the draft science content. So here are some resources to check out to help you understand the meaning and the intent of the alternate eligible content. We've been talking about the PSSA math glossaries and the PSSA ELA glossaries. Both are available on that PA alternate assessment subpage that you can find on our patent website for students with significant cognitive disabilities. Take advantage of it. They are really very thoughtfully laid out and described. Math has pictures and diagrams to really help you understand what it is that they're asking, to help you make more informed decisions about what you would like to use or what you would like to offer as prioritized content for students. We also have the alternate eligible content across the grades documents, and that's also on that Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities page, and it's under the alternate eligible content. So you can find the across the grades document for math and for English language arts / reading. We are currently working on the across the grades writing document and hope to have that available for you in the very, very near future. Watch for an email blast if you're part of our listserv. That should be coming out soon. And then we also have, and as you know from our fall webinars, our essentialized examples. We continue to grow that site, and our goal is to have one example for each piece of alternate eligible content, but it helps you to understand the meaning and the intent of the alternate eligible content. Remember, they're not lesson plans, they're not unit plans, but what they will do is give you more information about what that content is asking students to know and be able to do. So take advantage of it and look at those resources. So that's your first piece, thinking about the content. The second part we discussed was gathering information about your student or students that you're currently considering to write IEP goals and objectives. So first of all, what does your students' performance data tell you in regard to English language arts, reading, writing, and math, and science, as it relates to that content? Now that you know the grade level, you've kind of looked at the content across the grade level, now what you're going to do is think about, okay, now here's my student. What do my students know about addition in small sets? Can they demonstrate understanding? Have they done that? What does that look like? Do my students know what slope is? Do I know what slope is? What is it that I need to pull together in regard to information about my students that's going to help me make informed decisions about selecting content that would be prioritized in an IEP goal? Think about what data collection procedures you're using. This is a great time to think about that. And how often are you collecting the data? Is there anything you would change? I know when I was in the classroom as a teacher in a life skills classroom, I often was collecting. I collected a lot of data across a lot of different content areas that I was teaching. I didn't always get to examine the data right then as I was teaching. I did the best I could, but I would often then at the end of the day or early before the students arrived, I would then evaluate the data and make decisions about what was going to happen next. It also helped me when I got to my time of writing IEP goals and objectives to clearly indicate what my students knew and could do. So the data piece is huge. So you want to make sure that you have a real solid way that you're collecting data in the classroom, and not just collecting it, getting some time, however you can manage. And I know classrooms are busy from the moment the day starts till the day ends. But if there's some time, even in once a week, once every other week, that you can evaluate and look at the data and make decisions, that is as critical as collecting it. The other thing you need to collect about your students is to think about their communication, language, and vocabulary systems. We know that this could be very unique for each student. How do they take information in? How are they, when you teach, what is the best way for them to process information and be able to manipulate it? And how do they show what they know? How are you able to engage them in instruction as you are providing information and getting them to manipulate information? And then how do they show you information? And also consider the student's level of learning for the purposed goal. So how independent can they be? Do they need prompted? Do we have to have direct responses? What's that going to look like? And you want to make sure that you have that information in regard to each student. You probably already have all of this. If you have it written down somewhere, that's great. If there's a way that you have it collected through data, that is probably the most effective way to keep that information and share that information with others. It's going to be really important because all of that has to be included when you think about your IEP goals and objectives. Another thing I'm going to challenge you to do is you're gathering information about the student, you're thinking about the student, and you're starting to put together some of this information. I'm going to challenge you to think about this alternate eligible content as if it were essentialized. In some cases, in many cases, we're going to have to think about that to help you determine that priority for your IEP goals and objectives. And how essentialized, how much more you need to reduce the complexity really is going to depend upon your individual students. So, and it might look different across kids, and that's okay. You know, consider what's meaningful for the students. What's going to impact the quality of their life? What's going to impact their goals? Maybe you have students who are in those transition years. Maybe you have students pre-transition, but you're already thinking about that with the families, thinking about what is meaningful. And to help you do that, review those essentialized examples. They are going to be very important. And I'm not just saying that. I'm saying that because teachers are providing us feedback and saying that is what is really helping them to think about what this content is all about. These samples have really helped to boost their understanding. So if you haven't looked at them already, please go in and take a look. So putting it all together, when we think about becoming familiar with that alternate eligible content, and then we're thinking about what we know about the student, gathering information, and we put that all together to get us in a place to be ready to write and to craft some draft IEP goals, some draft objectives to provide when meeting with the IEP team, or to draft up for the IEP team as a result of conversations. Think about that selected, examine the selected content. So you've prioritized some things. What does the student need to know and be able to do? And you're going to blend that with, based upon the student's current performance data related to the alternate eligible content, what could be reasonable yet challenging? We write goals and objectives to be met within the time frame of the IEP. And we also want to write these to demonstrate new learning. Okay, we've talked about what we need to do to get started, some pieces of information we need to be considering. Now let's jump into thinking about how do I construct these goals, and we're going to look at English language arts first, and then we're going to move into math. I do want to assure you that what we're going to share today are samples. They're not exact, but they're samples that we hope will guide you as you consider putting your pieces of the IEP goals and objectives together. Kind of trying to pull together all the information we've learned to date. So your template's going to look familiar. This was part of our 2014 presentation, but you want to write good IEP goals. There are pieces that need to be part of it that we've learned, that there are conditions related to the content presentation. That's going to involve some pieces that we learn about in the content. So when we essentialize our content into the know, do, and context pieces, all of this is going to be helpful when we think about conditions, and we need to think about the context, and we need to think about how the student's going to show us what they need to know and how they're going to do that. And that's all part of what's in that alternate eligible content. So it's a matter of thinking about how we essentialize that, how do we put that into our goal through this template, and then adding the measurements so that we know what's going to be our indicator that the students achieve this goal. So let's go back and think about how we essentialize the content, because that's really going to take us into writing our goal. I want to make that connection for you today, and I hope that it is helpful when you think about writing, and you think about writing as related to the alternate eligible content. So I picked this piece of content, Summarize the Text. This is actually in 5th grade, but if you're familiar with the alternate eligible content, and I know many of you are, this piece of content appears in English language arts across the grades. It appears in literature, it appears in informational text. So chances are you will probably or may be considering a piece of content like this. And in this particular case, we're looking at informational text. So just to kind of couch that for you. You guys are experts at this. So if we think about what do we need to know, so the student's going to need to know summarizing. What is summarizing? In order to do it, you need to know what it is. This is kind of a little trickier piece of content that we've shown you before when we think about essentializing. But it's true. You need to know what summarizing is to be able to do it effectively. So obviously the do is summarizing, how you summarize. So what is summarizing and how you do it, really two different things. And what's the context? Well, it's going to be the grade appropriate text. We're going to be looking at the text. And as we've been going along, we've also been providing for you intent. And so a really broad statement or thinking about what summarizing the text might be would be to tell, show, describe some key elements of the text that relay the overarching big idea in your own words in a logical sequence. So thinking about it in a broader sense. And we're going to take that information and we're going to apply it to our goal in a quick second. But I also want to not leave this moment without walking you through this conversation I really want you to have inside your head or with a colleague or with your IEP team. What's meaningful about summarizing? When we look at the definition in the PSSA ELA glossary, you can see that on the screen. It's really about capturing the most important parts of a text, but expressing them in a much shorter space and in as much as possible in the reader's own words. And so that's really important when we think about sharing about what we've read. So it's very important to express fluently or accurately something you've read or heard from a text, and we do want our students to be able to share that accurately, but we also can see this generalized into thinking about sharing fluently and accurately when you're conversing. And if you sat in any of my sessions in conferences, you will often hear me talk about, as a teacher, probably one of the most exciting days was Monday, and Monday mornings when my students would come back from the weekends, and they all had something exciting to tell me, or most of them did, of what happened. And sometimes I really felt like I was Dan the detective trying to put it all together, because I get a piece here and a piece there, and I would be trying to fill in the spots. But what a great skill to teach our students to be able to kind of think about what it means to pull something together in a succinct kind of way and share it without giving too much details, knowing what's too much, knowing what's just right to be able to share. And whether you're sharing it with words orally, or whether you're sharing it with a device, or whether you're sharing it through pictures or gestures or signs, it doesn't matter. But just being able to succinctly kind of pull things together. And even more critically important than the social piece is if you have to share important critical information on a job, or if there's an emergency, thinking about summarizing and pulling together just the facts, or pulling together the important pieces to share, is going to be something that can make this piece of content very meaningful. So let's take a look at this piece of content, summarizing the text. And I want to walk you through thinking about how we coded it. Summarizes the know, summarizes the do. The text is the context. So how can we look at that through different lenses of complexity when we think about summarizing the text? Now you're going to look at this goal and you're going to notice it looks rather long, but what I did is I pulled in lots of different examples of information. You would not need it all. You would pick what would be most important to your student. There are some pieces that may stay the same. It could change just variantly depending on your student. And again, it's just a sample. So let's take a look at this. I also kept the intent on the page just to kind of help you keep in the back of your mind, what's that big overarching concept that we're trying to get to? So if you look at this goal, given a modified grade appropriate informational text that is read by the student, here we go, or read to the student. So either one of those could go in there. And of course you wouldn't use the word the student, you would use the student's name. And in this case, highlighting 3 important components, because we want to make sure they summarize with the key elements. The student will use their own words, or in this case, they're going to initiate that sharing of information however they best communicate to provide this brief statement of some important points. And we're going to demonstrate it with some measurement at the end. So let's take a look at this. What is it that students need to know? So what the know is, they're going to be able to use these key elements. That's really the critical piece of summarizing, is that you're using your own words in this case, but you've got to pull those key elements in. So that's really important. What do they need to do with those 3 elements? So we're going to have them use their own words, however they use it, to provide this brief statement. And within what context? Well, we're going to use modified grade appropriate informational text. It's going to be modified because we have to at some point, if they could read the grade level informational text, they probably wouldn't be taking the PASA. And some of the other conditions we'd be looking at is whether it's read by the student or read to the student. And then, of course, we have it within 100% of the time in 3 consecutive probes. We want the students to learn this. So we don't want them to learn half of it or not all of it. We want to have them demonstrate this 100% of the time. So just to give you some examples, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this just because we have a lot to get through today. You see the goal up there, and there are some examples of some potential 3 objectives. These could be provided in lots of different ways, but important information students may need to know and be able to do to get to this goal. And I like to write them, so at the bottom is where we're kind of starting and we work our way up to the goal. Some people write them the other way. It doesn't matter as long as they're there. But if you look down at the bottom of the page, we're going to start with the student being able to identify some of that new unknown vocabulary that might be in that piece of text to make sure that they understand what we're talking about. And then we're going to move on, seeing, can the student even tell me what the story's about? If it's about hurricanes, can they tell me, it's about hurricanes or it's about a big storm or whatever? And then we're going to move into, can they even tell me some of the key pieces in that story? We're going to 1 or 2 key pieces, and we want to get them to pulling together 3 in this case. So they're using their own words to kind of give us the big important pieces. And maybe there's 4 in this story. We'd want to add 4. It would all be dependent upon the text. So what does this look like if we reduce it a little bit? So we're looking at kids that maybe would not be performing at the level that it's written, but maybe we're going to be putting some more pieces in there for them to be able to demonstrate understanding. So let's look at what we've done with incorporating what the students need to know, do, and under what context. Then we'll look at conditions and measurement. So first, what do they need to know? In this case, we're really going to take it down to maybe a piece of text that there's only 2 really important pieces. So we recognize the student may need to only be able to hold on to a couple key elements that are going to make this important, and they're going to be able to do it in a logical way. And how are they going to be able, what's the do? How are they going to do this? How are they going to summarize this? In this case, we're going to give them some choices. They may need visuals or manipulatives, and you can write that we'll be given visuals or we'll be given manipulatives. You don't have to put all of these words in, but I added all these examples. And we would also encourage at this level that there's some words that are supporting that, whether they're spoken words that identify it, or they're written words, or they're spoken and written words to support these choices. And then the student's going to select the accurate choices that relay the important parts of the text. That's the way they're going to provide this summary. So they're going to summarize by letting you know the key elements. They're going to kind of tell the story with the pictures. And we're going to be greatly modifying the text. So how the text is reduced is also reduced in complexity. Some of the conditions, that we're still going to keep it, maybe it's read by the student, but more likely it's read to the student. And our measurement is going to be 100% of the time in 3 consecutive probes. So let's reduce, before we look at least complex, here's some examples of some objectives that could support that. Again, we would always start, and I start down at the bottom, identifying some new unknown vocabulary under a lot of variety of conditions to make sure they understand what we're talking about. Again, if we're talking about hurricanes and we want them to be able to understand that this is about a storm, and that make sure that they know what that is. Or if the choices that we're using, do they know what those choices are? And then they, from a field of choices, be able to even tell us what the story's about after we've taught some of the vocabulary. And then could they highlight at least one component of the story? We'd like, in this case, we're asking them to have 2 pieces, so there is like a beginning and an end piece to this text that they're relaying back to us. So at the least complex, what is it that we're going to ask students to know? It's the same kind of goal, but it's reduced even more. We're just going to ask them to highlight a component of what the text is about. Again, we're going to use choices. We're going to always probably be supporting it with either spoken words, sign, whether you use visuals or manipulatives, you would build that in. You would never say the student. You would be using a student's name and having them select the accurate choice. So it represents the most important part of the text. And then our context, significantly modified grade appropriate informational text. It's going to be, we're going to have it highly supported, and the condition, it will be read to the student. And then, of course, we're going to have them demonstrate that they're able to do this 100% of the time in 3 consecutive probes. Again, this is the end after you've done a lot of instruction to get a student to be able to share about what they've heard. So our objectives here, if you go down to the bottom and work your way up, again, you're going to be looking at making sure, do they even know a storm from, not a storm from a tree, a storm from a sunny day, if this is a story about hurricanes. And then again, you would be able to work on unknown vocabulary in regard to the point of the text. If it's about safety in hurricanes or safety in storms, can they? What is the vocabulary around there that you want to make sure that your student knows? And then you want to move into can they even tell you from a field of choices what the story is about? So being able to first understand what the vocabulary is, and then moving into, after reading a story, having them being able to tell you what the story is about. And then if it's about safety and the storm, can they pull that out with where we're going with this goal? Again, you would use topics that are familiar and topics that are meaningful to your student if storms are not. That was just my example today. But you could use whatever is going to be important in an informational text format. And again, grade appropriate. In this case, we were looking at summarizing the text in 5th grade. It could look different topics that would be grade appropriate at different grade levels. So that's our tour, our whirlwind tour of ELA. Let's take a look now at math. Math is going to follow a similar template. It has not changed. These are the things that make an IEP goal very strong and very measurable, and a way to tell if your student is making progress. Let's take a look at it as it relates to alternate eligible content, and we start first with essentializing the content, because we're going to use this information in writing our IEP goal and objective. So what do students need to know? In this piece of 6th grade alternate eligible content, classify 3-dimensional figures. Well, student needs to know figures. What are they? Do they know them? What do they need to do with them? They need to classify them. And of course, you guys are pros at this now, so I'm sure you've already figured all of this out. So classifying is what makes figures the same. And in what context? We're looking at it through the lens of 3-dimensional figures. So that now you've kind of got it parsed down to where if you prioritize this as an IEP goal, this is what you might do. And when we think 3-dimensional, we're thinking cubes, cylinders, prisms, those kinds of things. But thinking about 3D shapes and how this can be relevant to students, think about them in real life situations that students encounter. Alternate eligible content really does have relevance when you consider long-term implications for learning the content. Alternate eligible content really provides foundational concepts that can be further fleshed out within the intent. And in this case, your intent is arranging 3D shapes into groups with common figures. But it provides you as a teacher maybe a straightforward way to teach it, but multiple ways to generalize it. So thinking about these shapes and where they appear in your student's world, we could have, with our cubes, think about tissue boxes, packing boxes, lots of things that appear as cubes in life. And I mean, look around your classroom. You probably see a lot of things. It might be a speaker. That's a cube. Cylinders could be drinking glasses. Think about toilet tissue and paper towel tubes. In elementary school, you have playground equipment that are tubes that students can crawl through. Or maybe you're out in the grocery store and there are cans of food or cans of soup. So shapes have a lot of impact in our world and can, at the very least, impact the quality of your life if you can at least partially participate and identify things through understanding shapes. So how is this meaningful? Thinking long term, could be a job task. It could be stacking and sorting similar shapes, organizing a space, finding an item. cleaning up, putting similar shapes together. So teaching it just to teach it through a just pure math lens is invaluable for any student. We want to make sure, how can we take this information and then make it valuable for long-term learning. And we've had webinars on those. If you haven't seen it yet, make sure you go back and check those out. So here's an example of alternate eligible content with MAP, with this piece of content classifying three-dimensional figures. So if we look at this and we look at this goal, what is it that students need to know? Well, they need to know those shapes of various sizes and colors. And they also need to know these 3D characteristics to help them, particularly if they're different sizes and colors. We've now made this at the most complex level. They're really going to need to know these 3D characteristics. And what do they need to do with them? Well, we're going to have them sort them into like categories. Things that have common features. So within what context? Well, these have to be 3D. We're not working on 2D shapes. And within what conditions? So we're going to use visuals, and maybe the student can use manipulatives. However, your student best can take information in, show what they know. In this case, we're going to ask them to do it independently. And we're going to measure it as demonstrated 100% of the time in 3 consecutive probes. So in our most complex level, we're really putting some non-relevant discrimination attributes in to make sure that they're really using those three-dimensional characteristics. And we're going to look at that in our next slide here. When we think about the objectives. So in the objectives, we're really going to first make sure that they may be able to identify or label these shapes. This is a cube, this is a cylinder, under a variety of conditions, make sure they really know them. And then we're also going to be looking at the attributes, such as the faces, or we may think about that as sides, or the edges, you know, the lines or the length. Vertices, those are the points. So teaching and making sure, do they know these different things? Because you could have a cube, you could have a rectangular prism, you could have lots of different things that look similar, but what's going to make them different? So those are some things that we can think about when we think about objectives and getting our student to that goal. Now at the mid-level, let's think about how we're going to reduce complexity when we're thinking about the no. So we're going to also be using some of these 3D characteristics. We may not be using as many. We may want to put that in our goal. But we're going to be using shapes of the same size and color that are labeled and maybe situated in some unique areas. So we're going to provide a lot of support. You could just have them labeled and not in unique areas. It would depend on your student and what that goal, what would be challenging, yet reasonable and attainable for your student. What do we want them to do with it? We're going to want them to sort them into like categories. And again, our context, it's going to be 3D. That context isn't really going to be reduced too much because the 3D is going to be an important piece of the intent, so we need to make sure that that maintains. We can reduce the number of 3D shapes, and that can be a reduction in complexity, but they have to be 3D. And under what conditions? Again, we can use visuals, we can use manipulatives. Maybe you're just going to use manipulatives at this level with your student. Remember, there's a continuum between that most, mid, and least complex, and we talked about that a lot. So you want to make sure that remains. Independently can mean the student indicates to another and the other person manipulates it, but in some way the student's initiating that classifying. We're really reducing the complexity in the way the shapes are represented. So there's only a discrimination of the attributes, and the other attributes such as color and size remain the same. So they're not having to do that extra discrimination. And we're only having them look at things that are related to that 3D kind of perspective. In our objectives here, again, we're going to want them to identify and label anything that's unknown to them. So they may, we want them to be able to know the difference maybe between a cube and a cylinder. And then we are also going to need them to know some attributes, but maybe we're just going to stick to the edges and the faces because we're going to reduce the complexity for this for some students. Because remember, within that alternate assessment, you can demonstrate achievement at 3 different levels of complexity. And so this could be potentially one area level of complexity. So at the least complex level, what do students need to know? Well, they're going to need to know some 3D characteristics, but unlike the other characteristics, we're going to have shapes that are distinctly different. And they're going to have the same size and color. We're not going to have any kind of discrimination that way. But these shapes are going to be distinctly different. So a cube versus a cylinder. Not things that look like cubes or rectangular prisms. We're going to have things that look very distinctly different. What are they going to do with it? We're going to ask them to sort them into like categories. Under what context? We're still going to use the 3D, but we're manipulating that 3D into some very distinct differences. And in this case conditions, we're going to use manipulatives and probably a model to support the student. And again, as demonstrated 100% of the time in 3 consecutive probes. What could our objectives look like? Well, we may start with having the student be able to, through direct instruction, identify and label the unknown shapes. Do we know that they know what a cube is? And they can show you a cube. They can find the cube, or we could call the box if you didn't want to use the word cube. And then can we have them even match same? So if they have 3 3D shapes of similar color and size, 2 are the same, 1 is different, can they match the 2 that are the same? That could be an objective. Again, getting us to a place where we can give them a group of those 3D shapes that are distinctly different and they can separate them by the attributes of the 3D. It's not where they're all going to be the same size, same color. We're not sorting by color. We're not sorting by size. But we're looking at these 3D shapes, cubes and cylinders, or cubes and prisms. It doesn't even matter that they can tell that they're different and that they're moving them, and they're different based on these 3D characteristics. But we're not asking them to label the 3D characteristics. So that's totally different, a reduction of complexity for this group. So some tips when writing these standards aligned IEP goals and objectives we want to leave you with. Goals and objectives are targets. They're not teaching sequences. We're going to be teaching to get us to these targets. We're going to be measuring along the way and have some sufficient data that's going to inform us in our decisions about the alternate eligible content and what students have learned. The details in your IEP goals and objectives should be specific to students. I used a lot of broad terms. I used the word the student. You would use student names. If they respond to manipulatives, you would use manipulatives and not visuals. You wouldn't say visuals and or manipulatives. Be specific. Your data that comes out of that then is very reflective of what the student knows and can do. You want to make sure that you're considering, as we've taught you through the essentialization process, consider that know and do and context and include that in your goal and objectives. But particularly your goals. And your objectives need to build towards the mastery of the goal. Be realistic. Think about the meaningfulness and what that intent or concept is taking your student to know and be able to do. That is lifelong learning and impacts life. But be challenging. We don't want to select things that we know our students can do 100% already. We want to make sure that it's based upon what we know they can do, and we up the ante and we make it more complex for them, and then structure our instruction to get them there. So you should have, as part of the materials for today's presentation, a handout that's called handout number 1, and that is what you're seeing on the screen. It's exactly what we've talked about today. It's meant to be a guide for you, something to think about as you're developing IEP goals and objectives related to alternate eligible content. And it has you consider these 6 pieces within those goals and objectives. Have you included conditions upon which the student will demonstrate achievement? Are you considering, in number 2, what the know is of the alternate eligible content? Is it in the goal, and is it as it appears, or is it essentialized? That's okay if it's essentialized, but is that know there? Can you speak eloquently to where that appears? Is there the do? Think about the do. If it's classifying, how is the student showing you classifying? If it's summarizing, how are they showing you summarizing? Is that do included, whether it's essentialized or whether it's as it appears, in that piece of goal? Are you considering the context? Is the context there? Is it essentialized? Is it modified text, greatly modified text? Is it really significantly modified text? Is it, the 3D objects? How many 3D objects? You can essentialize that, but you have to make sure that that context is represented as it is considered in the alternate eligible content. Have you thought about the communication and language preferences? When we think about how our students are going to show us what they know, when they do that do, are there considerations we need to put in there? When they take that information in, when that knowledge, are there considerations we need to put in there? Like we did with the way the 3D objects are discriminated. Are we making sure that we're considering what's relative and challenging for our particular students? And have you included that measurement statement that clearly indicates that the student has achieved that goal or that objective? So if you keep this with you, this little checklist, I think this will help guide you when you are writing your IEP goals and objectives related to alternate eligible content. I promised you at the very beginning, remember the stepping stones, that what do you do next? So you've written your goal and objective related to alternate eligible content. Feel pretty good about it. Yeah, Sharon, I included all those pieces, and I've instructed it, collected my data, and the student demonstrated they achieved this goal. Woohoo! It's good times. Feeling really good about that, and you should. That is excellent. That is what we want to do. This is all about students, and it is all about students learning. So, if we essentialized the alternate eligible content and the student learned it really quickly, like I taught it within the first lesson, and the student was able to demonstrate that they knew that. I gave them 3 probes. I left it for a little bit, came back, and they still showed me that they knew it. And that was pretty quick, Sharon, and I was really excited. I would say you might want to increase the complexity of that piece of content. You know, the student learned it really fast and we want to celebrate that. But let's try and challenge them and see if they can do it. And if we do and they achieve that goal, that's awesome. Or if they achieve it right away at the highest level of complexity, then let's select the next piece of alternate eligible content and begin instruction. Now, you say to me, Sharon, I collected the data and you know what? This student's not demonstrating achievement. I taught it. I'm telling you, I've taught it. I've tried it. Student's not learning. I will challenge you to reteach, change the conditions you're teaching under, change maybe the complexity, change maybe the way you're delivering it, try different ways. Maybe you need to back up, teach a couple skills that the student may need, collect your data, and yes, the student demonstrates achievement. It's awesome. You can then select another piece of alternate eligible content and begin instruction. But you say, you know what, Sharon, I did that. I retaught it. I changed my conditions, changed the way I taught it, got all kinds of data backing this up. I even tried to teach some skills leading up to it and some basic skill acquisition, some things that they might have needed to know that I didn't even think about before, collected my data, and you know what? The student's still not showing me they can do it. What do I do now? So we would recommend that you would evaluate that data. Just, is there something you missed somewhere? Maybe reteach it, or maybe in this case, maybe this piece of content has not demonstrated relevancy or meaningfulness. Maybe this piece of content we need to just think about moving on to another piece and begin instruction, rather than continuing to teach something that the student is not acquiring. So this is really some general simplification of database decision making when you're delivering lessons and units of instruction. And that when we're thinking about alternate eligible content relating to goals and objectives in the IEP, we know that collecting data along the way really ensures that some effective decision making happens that impacts what students are learning. And I know you guys see that on a daily basis. I want to this slide I hope, wet your whistle to think about the remaining webinars in this series that's going to address the implementation of instruction that helps to lead students to learning this related to alternate eligible content. We're going to be discussing all of this in more depth over the next few months. So I want to send out a huge thank you to everyone that responded to our webinar survey back in December, because these topics, starting with this one about IEPs, really represents what you asked for. So that's what we're going to do. And these are the topics that are coming up. Next month, it's going to be thinking about taking those essentialized examples into lesson and unit planning. We're going to really be looking at effective instructional delivery in March, data collection and decision making in April, and then looking at essentialized examples for writing and science in May. Our focus today was identifying this writing alternate eligible content and thinking about using that process for essentialization examples. If you are not part of our listserv, and you heard me mention that earlier in our webinar today, please sign up. You can go to our patent website and you'll see the listserv volunteer button. You can, or in that box where we have our previously recorded webinars and our alternate eligible content, there's a listserv volunteer place. You can click on that and sign up. We have work ongoing. Let me tell you, there's lots of work. We're thinking about more work in regard to essentialized examples and more volunteer opportunities in regard to thinking about writing and science. So please sign up if you haven't already. For further information, Linda Lupp, you heard her last month. Here's her contact information. Myself and Audrey Capel are available to answer your questions. If you would like to receive a certificate of completion for attending today's webinar, please record this code and answer the questions found at the SurveyMonkey link, which is with the link for this webinar.